Today we speak with Dr. Miki Ben-Dor, who is a paleoanthropologist who focuses on the interaction between the human diet and evolution. He has a PhD in archaeology out of the University of Tel Aviv, and he has produced some really compelling and interesting research within this space. Particularly, one of his most profound papers looked at humans in a trophic level, which in biology suggests where they sit as far as the food chain, and suggested that humans are actually in the category of hyper-carnivores. And of course, this has shed quite a lot of controversy and a lot of information and discussion within the space. But he's produced a plethora of papers in support of the evidence, looking at the paleoanthropological evidence in relation to human evolution and diet. And so there's a lot of really valuable information there. This podcast does get into the weeds a little bit in some of the scientific discussion, and we cover a few of the high-level items that Miki has researched that support his position of looking at humans as hypercarnivores, ranging from things like biology and physiology to anthropology and a host of other items. So really interesting discussion with Dr. Miki Ben-Dor. I highly recommend, if you find this interesting, to actually look at his papers, which will be referenced here for you guys, because we don't cover all of the topics and we don't get into the really minutia and the details. So if you are interested in learning more about this, really recommend that you check out those reference papers, as it gets into much more detail. And as I said, he has provided a very large range of evidence in support of this position. So it's a very interesting talk with Dr. Miki Ben-Dor. Hope you guys enjoy it. And of course, this podcast is brought to you by Vital Origin, Australia's best and most ethical animal-based brand, helping you reintroduce nature's most nutrient-dense superfoods back into your diet. For all of our listeners, you can get an extra 10% off at checkout by using the discount code SOURCE10. All right, on to our show with Dr. Miki Ben-Dor. All right, Miki, well, thank you for coming on the Vital Origin podcast. I've followed a lot of your research for quite some time, so I'm very excited to have a talk with you.
Thank you, my pleasure.
All right. So I'm sure there are some people who have come across some of your research already, but there's probably many people in the general public who maybe haven't come across your research yet. But before we jump into that, it's always great to get to know you a little bit more and understand a bit of your backstory, so people understand, where your academic background is, but also, why you came to study what you study now.
Right. So I'll start with academic. I actually studied economics and later business administration as a second degree. And at the age of 52, I decided to quit work. I could afford it. And so I decided not to work anymore. Because I always used the hunter-gatherers as a model. And they didn't work the way we consider work today in hierarchical situations where you don't own your time. You sell your time, actually, to some other people. So I decided that that was enough. And at one stage, I found a place to study more about hunter-gatherers in the Tel Aviv University, which ended up in a PhD in paleoanthropology. And here we are today.
Yeah, fantastic. I only recently realized that you had an economics background after listening to your podcast with Anthony Shafee. And I think that's quite interesting and valuable because it gives you a different insight and ways of looking at things, like from an economics perspective, cost benefit analysis,
Absolutely.
thinking in systems and sort of looking at the bigger picture, where people who maybe went only into one science and one study, say they only went straight into paleoanthropology, they may be slightly indoctrinated, or they maybe view things in a different way. And I think that's probably given you a very different perspective, which has allowed you to approach this in probably a little bit of a different light, which is fantastic.
Yeah, the one thing specific, for instance, is the importance of energy budget. Really, when you talk about the evolution of any animal, you have to consider the energy budgets, and this is like money. So follow the money. Became to me follow the energy.
That's a great analogy.
It's the same principles. I'm not the only one in paleoanthropology to consider economic considerations, but there are not many. And the ones that do it tend to be more mechanical.
Mm,
Anyway, they not necessarily come to the same conclusions, but that's what helped me. That's what brought me, to where I am today, and especially that, and looking energetic constraints, and looking at other constraints like the protein metabolism constraint. So
mm,
it's around the constraints that you find a lot of explanations. Take, for example, the speed of light in Einstein's theory. This is where a lot of the explanations are found. And this is why I think I was fortunate enough to identify these constraints and to see how they can explain human evolution.
mm. And I think we see this applied quite a bit in evolutionary biology. And for me, my background, clinical nutrition and things like that nature, I feel in medicine, they often miss that. They miss sort of the evolutionary perspective in general. I think they tend not to look too far back, which is a shame because it can often indicate and dictate why we see a lot of the disease and issues we see in the modern day. But that can be a whole separate talk. I'd like to stick to the paleoanthropology side. And so for people who have maybe not come across that term before, could you explain a little bit for the listeners of what paleoanthropology is itself?
Yeah, anthropology is the study of humans, the biology of human, the culture of human, the behavior of humans. And paleoanthropology is studying these things during the Paleolithic period, which lasted from about 2.6 million years ago to about 10,000 years ago. In some
Yeah, so
places later to about 5,000 years.
it's quite long time scales, and I think that's where a lot
Yeah.
of people
This is the time when human evolution took place.
exactly, and that's
When
why
we
it's very
became,
important.
yeah,
And that's what I want to dig into, and I guess that's the whole paleo approach or evolutionary model to health. And I think people have a difficult time understanding that time scale, right? Millions of years. But when we think about evolution and what shaped human biology and shaped Homo sapiens as we are now, it's really been those millions of years. And we'll talk about the context of recent change in the Neolithic period, but people struggle to think in hundreds of years, let alone millions of years. And unfortunately, I think that's where we go wrong in looking at this view of how we should approach health overall. And so from a human evolution perspective, what does that look like? So to give the listeners a bit of a breakdown of how we went from, I guess, Paleolithic to, or even if you wanted to touch on even pre-Paleolithic and early hominids into modern day humans, what does that story look like of becoming us today as Homo sapiens?
okay, we can
In
start
in in
the
brief.
story. We can start the story with the primates, where we came from. We used to live on trees as primates, and the chimpanzee is the closest relative. If you want to imagine what our lives were at 7 million years ago. And then, about 6, 7 million years ago, the climate in Africa changed and the more open area became available. And some primates came down from the trees and started to explore uh, the open space for nutrition, and eventually became what's called Australopithecus. It's another genus that really look like chimpanzees, but is bipedal, in other words, walking. And chimpanzees can also walk, but Australopithecus, the main difference was that the exit of the from the head was from the bottom and not from the back. So it means that it was more adapted to walking. And so this is where we started as a terrestrial animal, terrestrial species, Australopithecus. And then the theory goes, and I think it's quite widely accepted, is that the savanna become a dominant feature of some part of Africa. And this is actually where larger animals became more available and plants became less available, plant food. So the adaptation of the Homo really was to obtaining foods from animals rather than plants. So in our opinion, the top predator was Homo erectus. So we started with Homo habilis, which was by the teeth, you can say, was more a member of the previous Australopithecus group as far as chewing, let's say, and then Homo erectus, which was, in our opinion, a carnivore, and from Homo erectus, the next species that is more or less agreed upon is Homo heidelbergensis, and then Homo sapiens. So this is, and all that time, it was the process was the evolution was accompanied by a major feature, which is increase in the brain size.
Yeah.
There were other, of course, features that evolved, but this is the most visible.
Sort of the most prominent. Yeah. And somewhat what defines us as modern humans, as Homo sapiens, is really the cognitive development and the development of the frontal cortex and sort of the more advanced areas of the brain, which will definitely get into that. And I think that paints a nice picture for people to understand a little bit of the history. And as you said, a lot of this occurred through the Paleolithic period, dating back, many millions of years. And I definitely want to touch on some of the carnivore parts. And it's probably one of your, I guess, most famous papers now that a lot of people have had discussions with you about, which was the evolution of the human trophic level during the Pleistocene, which is really this sort of pivotal moment where it appears that we went from Homo erectus that became much more carnivorous, as you said, and then which, so the theory goes, allowed more evolution into modern humans. And of course, then this should shape the narrative around what should our nutrition be now as still modern day Homo sapiens. So I think this is where it gets very exciting, but there's certainly a lot of controversy in the space because a lot of the guidelines around the world now are sort of pushing more a plant-based nutritional guideline, which seems to go counter to what your evidence and a few other researchers in the spaces shows as being more carnivorous. And perhaps this is a good point to define what it means, or maybe even starting with what a trophic level is, because for those without a biology background, they may not know what a trophic level is. And then we can go into, what is the definition from that perspective of what a carnivore is, because I think some people have a misconception of a carnivore being something that only eats 100% meat, and we can get into that.
Right. So trophic level start with, it's actually a number from 0 to 5 or 6 even. And as you go up the food chain, the number increases. So it starts with the plants, which has a number of 1, and then animals that eat plants, which have 2, and then animal that eat plants, And then animals that eat plants, etc., etc. It goes up more higher than 3, more in aquatic systems. And terrestrial systems, yeah, there are some animals that can live on eating carnivores. The carnivores is 3.
Mm.
But that's happened more in aquatic systems, especially in the sea.
Yeah.
So the question with humans were, and nobody argues about it, between 2 and 3. So they eat plants. There's no argument about it. We ate plants all over our evolution, the time of our evolution. And we eat animals. There's no argument about that too. The argument is on 2 things. What was the number? Was it 2.9 or 2.32? Or how flexible we were in our trophic level? And this is why you don't find a lot of discussion about trophic levels, because most researchers assume that we are so flexible, we were so flexible in our trophic level that it really doesn't matter that much. Yeah, it's important for other animals, but humans are so smart and so powerful that they can tolerate anything, anytime. And we came against it. And as I mentioned in the beginning, it's mainly because of the main reason I think can be explained is if you follow energetics.
Mm.
So in humans, and this is different from animal to animal, in humans, at least according to recent information about recent hunter-gatherers, it's about 10 times more efficient for humans to obtain animals than to obtain plant food per calorie, per hour, let's say. So if it's 10 times more expensive to obtain plants than to obtain animals, we are not flexible. It's like you have a budget, as you get a salary, you go to a supermarket, and all of a sudden you find that the plants cost 10 times more than meat. You just cannot continue with the previous diet.
Yeah.
So, and this is really what happened. What was the situation? Maybe it was not 10 times, maybe it was 5 times, but basically we are more efficient in obtaining animals. We were more efficient in obtaining animals than obtaining plants. And this is not by chance. It's just the evolution of, our evolution was to be efficient in obtaining animals. There are several proof for that, or several support for this one Lieberman and Bramble that count like 22 changes in our morphology, in our bones, or that actually made us adaptable to running long distances. And you don't need to run long distances to obtain plants.
Yeah.
So it definitely was in order to obtain animal. And a lot of other adaptations made us more efficient. It's like, and this is sometimes mixed up, the fact that we were omnivores, with the fact that we were flexible or inflexible.
Yeah.
Omnivory doesn't mean that the animal is flexible. Like if you take, for instance, wolves. Wolves can sometimes in the season spend days eating berries. and they can eat berries and they can metabolize berries and everything is fine. But they are not adapted to live for a long time they are adapted to obtain animals. Chimpanzees, on the other hand, do hunt from time to time. Yeah, but really they live on trees and they are more adapted to identify fruits that are, that are available for them and to obtain them in competition with other animals, because everything has to be done in competition with other animals. So you have to be efficient at what you're doing. So actually, we found out that most of the mammals are really specialized. You have to be specialized because of competition. Really, even what we call general animals are not really general. Like if you take, for instance, bears. Now, bears are the ultimate omnivore. They live on leaves. They can eat leaves. They can eat berries. But they eat fish and they hunt small or small animals from time to time. But they are not flexible. If the salmon will not arrive one day, they are in big trouble. So it's not like they are flexible. They are dependent on specific conditions for their survival. And if the condition will change, they will be in trouble. So omnivory does not mean flexibility. And the problem stems from, researchers using recent hunter-gatherers as the model. And recent hunter-gatherers, actually, if you go around the world, you can see the Eskimos living on 100%, close to 100% meat or animal food. And you see in Africa groups that live maybe on 30% meat. And from that, you can assume that humans were flexible. But if you look at for instance, just take the African tribes, they cannot compare them to Paleolithic humans because these guys are using iron and they're using dogs. Dogs appeared on the scene. Dogs appeared on the scene maybe 20,000 years ago. So for more than 2 million years ago, humans did not have dogs. And you need dogs to hunt small animals. So it's just not the same. It's not the same technology. The environment is completely different where they live. Where they live, there are no longer elephants around, and elephants create environment. Elephants actually in Cougar Park were documented killing about 1,600 trees a year. So they are actually prepared the savannah. The savannah is dependent on an elephant. So if you go to these areas, a lot of them live on mogongo trees or other trees, baobab trees. But if there were elephants around, there would not have been that many mogongo trees or baobab trees around. So the environment is not the same, the technology is not the same, and the flexibility is not the same.
Yeah, this is and you highlighted this, the so-called tyranny of ethnography, which was quoted by Lieberman, right? Where we look at modern day hunter-gatherers and then try to take that as a representation of what Paleolithic hunter-gatherers were.
This is the mother of all evils, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's where a lot of it has gone wrong. Yeah, and I know that's a prime basis of a lot of your arguments in quite a few of your papers. And it's interesting too, because I even remember for myself thinking from an evolutionary perspective that being an omnivore and being flexible would confer an advantage, but it seems the evidence shows actually there seems to be an advantage of being more specialized.
Absolutely. This is what happened if you look at all the mammals. Mm-hmm. This is the tendency. This is what most of them found, actually, I believe all of them, even what we defined in this paper that you mentioned as generalized, general, they are not. Even if they're 50-50, they're not general.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
but most mammals actually specialize in terms, if you take animals food and plant food, most mammals have 70% or more of one of them,
Hmm.
if you want to call that a specialization. And you mentioned before that what is the definition of carnivore? Yeah, the definition of carnivore is not an animal that eats 100% meat. The zoologists found it useful to identify hyper-carnivores as carnivores that eat more than 70% of their diet in animals. In other words, most of the carnivores, not lions, for instance, don't eat 100%.
Yeah.
But wolves, as we said, don't. So, but they're still considered hyper-carnivores in zoological terms.
Yeah. And I think that definition is important, and we'll probably pause on that because most people are probably surprised to hear that. Because when most people think carnivore in the colloquial sense, they think just eating animal foods, meat, that type of thing. But from a zoological perspective or from a biology perspective, we're talking about it from 70% or more. And that shapes the narrative when we're talking about our evolutionary past, where we had Homo erectus, that the evidence would show we were probably more carnivore, if not hyper carnivore. And so I think that's a really nice segue into what is the evidence that suggests we were actually hyper carnivores during this really important transition in our evolution.
Right. Well, the trouble begins when people go to archaeologists to find out what the trophic level was. Because archaeologists, based on what they find in the individual sites, cannot tell that. In most of the methods in archaeology cannot say what the trophic level was. Because if you find usually most of what you find in Paleolithic archaeological sites is bones and stones.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is it's really boring. I mean, if you are not really into stones and bones, it's really boring.
Of course.
From time to time, in some special situations where a site was covered with water for most of its time, you find also some plants, because then there was not exposed to oxygen. So plant material also survived somehow, wood and things like that. And this is a real celebration. But and there's no way to tell what was the ratio of plant food to animal food from archaeological sites, because you don't even know if humans did not consume a lot of food out of the archaeological site. Just traveling around, finding a fruit here and there, or killing a small animal. There's no way to tell.
Mm.
The only way, which is really good, is to look at what's called stable isotopes. And in our case, the isotope of nitrogen, 15, which accumulates in the body based on the trophic level. So if you have a high concentration of the nitrogen isotope, then you are high on the trophic level. So what they do is they go to a site, they measure the trophic level of the herbivores, they measure the stable isotope 15, nitrogen 15 in herbivores and carnivores, known carnivores, and then they measure it in humans, and then they can say if humans were closer to the herbivores or closer to the carnivores. The problem with that method is that it's really, you need the collagen. And collagen doesn't preserve for a long time, especially in warm conditions. So there's no real findings in Europe in cold conditions. You can find collagen but going back about 50,000 years ago, the maximum. But then, because it's cold conditions, the diet is also biased because there are not so many plants. It's like going to the North Pole in Northern Territory. Yeah, so it's not representative of evolutionary diet. For that, you have to go to periods that are even if to get into warm conditions, like let's say the one case I know is in Sicily, where the oldest is about 11, 12,000 years. And there, the finding is that humans were carnivores.
Mm.
And then going back, and then 6,000 years ago, there's another finding. And this is that humans consumed fish. And then about 4,000 years ago, humans consumed plants, more plants. So this is more or less now, if you just take all the studies, you can see that all of them, almost all of them, close to 100% of them, point to humans being carnivores, coming together with the carnivores. But as I said, there are problems in the representation, how representative the sample is.
Yeah, yeah. Which is why I guess you looked at many other ways of verifying these findings, and I'm sure we won't cover all of them because the paper is quite in depth in looking at all the different aspects. So I'll definitely recommend people read the paper, but that's probably a nice segue into many of the other supporting evidence that you and your group have found.
Yeah, I think the most convincing one are ones where you don't need really to do a lot of interpretation. Because what we are looking for is the signs of carnivory or the signs of the trophic level in what we find. Okay, so in most cases we need to do some interpretation because we don't have directly the carnivore. But in some cases, the researchers themselves just compared carnivores with omnivores, and they found that humans belong to the carnivore group. For instance, in this, something that nobody would think about is the structure of fat cells. Okay, adipocytes in professional language. Fat cells of carnivores are many and small, and fat cells of omnivores and omnivores are large and few to hold the same amount of fat in the body. I won't go into the reason. There is some theory about why that is the situation. But this is the fact. Carnivores have smaller and much more cells, many more cells than omnivores. And lo and behold, human comes straight into the carnivore group. We have many smaller cells. And it's in 1985. The author writes, well, that shows us that humans were actually carnivores. I mean, they have found that. And since then, nobody mentioned it in any reconstruction attempt of human nutrition during the Paleolithic. Another thing that is mentioned, another thing similar, is the acidity of the stomach.
Mm.
So the acidity is there in the stomach for one of the reasons, maybe the major reason, I'm not sure, is to fight pathogens. And herbivores that eat grass don't encounter many pathogens, but scavengers that eat meat that was stayed for a day or two or three outside encounter many pathogens. So
Yeah.
if you look at the gradient of acidity in the stomach, it goes from 6 pH of 6, which is very close to water, so almost no acidity, to pH of 1.3 in, for instance, I don't know, some scavengers. And on the way, carnivores have 2.2, for instance, as an example. Well, humans have 1.5 pH. In other words, they come in very close to the scavengers, and the authors of the paper say, it sounds like humans were scavengers. Well, the authors don't know much about Paleolithic, because if they did, they would have known that humans are a special kind of carnivore. It doesn't eat, it doesn't exploit the prey where it was hunted. In other words, it just cut it, butcher it, and take it to a central place and sit on it. So if you manage to hunt a buffalo, your group can live on it for a week or two.
Yeah.
During that time, you actually behave like a scavenger. So you scavenge on what you hunted. So humans, in this respect, actually, it proves not only that humans were hunters, but it proves that humans were hunters of large animals because they were adapted to live on that animals for a long time.
Mm.
So only large animals, small animal, let's say a gazelle, like a small deer, would last a group one day. So if you take 25 people and calculate the energetic consumption of one day, they could live on that gazelle. But but like I said, if you hunt a buffalo, you can live on it for 2 weeks. If you hunt an elephant, you can live on it for God knows how many days. Now the other question is, but how can you preserve that meat for so much longer? And
Yeah.
there is a reply for that too. You smoke it, you dry it, and
Fermentation.
actually you can also eat putrid meat
Yeah.
with this kind of acidity in your stomach.
Yeah. I saw you
That's
actually
another.
in one of your papers, you had actually outlined a rough calculation of how long some of these large fatty animals would last us, and that ties very much into that energetic component, and then I guess ties also into the optimal foraging theory because, and I know this is a big part of a lot of the work you've done in looking at how these large fatty animals were such a foundation of our sort of evolution and what we prioritized in hunting. And we could probably get into the megafauna and sort of some of the papers that you looked at and how our prey sort of shaped and changed things over time. But I think it's worth touching on the optimal foraging theory for people because I guess that kind of brings together what we're talking about from the economics perspective and how that shapes what we would have prioritized for hunting. Could you maybe outline a little bit what that is for people?
Yeah, foraging theory come to answer the question is what an animal would, as carnivore, if we talk about carnivores, what prey they would take. How do they choose their prey? How do they choose the food? Actually, it composes also. It's relevant also for plant food. And the theory says that it depends the ranking of the prey depends on the energetic return, net energetic return, because you have to catch the prey and then you have to prepare it for consumption. Now, humans, and this is why when I said at the beginning, humans have to prepare plant food for consumption, and you find out that a lot of the food, plant food contain, most of them contain toxic compounds. So they have to be fermented, they have to be pounded, they have to be soaked. So if you put all the cost items of preparing them, energetic cost, the reward is not so high compared to large animals.
Yeah.
And we found, although there are people opposed to it, but for me as an economist, it's just ridiculous that they do. We found that larger animals have a higher return than smaller animals, and certainly higher return than plants. Well, they object to it. To me, it just doesn't make sense. It's like, I want to tell them sometimes, let's say you are looking for a franchise to explore, I don't know, for gold, an area. And so you prefer to get 10 smaller plots than one large plot that of equal size. It's crazy.
Yeah.
So
even just from a macronutrient perspective, fat versus carbohydrates, even from that simple metric, like the amount of calorie density in fat is sufficiently more than carbohydrates. So obviously it would be a preferential energy source when we're talking about survival.
Yes, it's well, with humans, there's the story of the protein constraint. And as I said, as an economist, that's what guides me. Look at the constraints, and you can get explanation key, because most of the behavior is meant to bypass the constraint. So humans are limited in the amount of protein that they can consume to about 35% of the diet. And the reason is that we're really newcomers to the carnivore guild. Carnivores are there, have been there for 30 million years. And we just came along about 2 million years ago, 2.5 million years ago. So in order to utilize protein for energy, we have to remove nitrogen, which is toxic. So the first thing that we do is remove the nitrogen, which really turns protein into sugar. So it's called gluconeogenesis, the new production of sugar from a new. And our ability to do that, to remove the nitrogen, first of all, and then to remove it from the body using kidneys, is limited. So if we can do it for 35%, what do we do with 65% that is left? We need to exploit either fat or carbohydrates. If the carbohydrates are so expensive to obtain, it means that the obvious solution is to go for fat. Mm-hmm. Now, the most efficient solution is the animal that you already killed will have as much fat as you can, as you can. And this is, by the way, it's a major explanation for humans' behavior during the Paleolithic period. If you go by the content of fat, you see that humans were trying to maximize the content of fat. The first candidate is the large animals, which contain more fat, not only absolute number, but also relative number. For instance, elephants, not only they contain more fat, but in dry periods, in other words, in periods where plant food is restricted because it's dry or because it's cold, elephants lose much less fat than smaller animals because they can utilize a much lower quality forage. So, and also for other reasons, large animals are more can be obtained more energetically efficiently. For instance, they don't tend to escape because they normally use their size. I mean, for instance, if you go, rhinos don't escape. Hippos don't escape. Elephants don't escape when you approach them. So if you manage to get them, you can actually save a lot of time that you would have otherwise spent chasing the animal. Even if you manage to, let's say, use a bow and arrow, stick an arrow into an animal, it will run away, and you'll spend a lot of time just chasing it until it dies. But if they don't escape, and you can actually limit their movement and approach the animal without, let's say you just dig a pit and they fall into it, cover it with leaf or whatever, and they fall into it, and that's it. So energetically speaking, large animals, which contain more fat, are easier to get. So that's one, let's say, pattern that we find that humans prefer large animals.
Yeah.
The other pattern is that humans prefer adults. In other words, which is, if you look at from a carnivore point of view, predator point of view, it's a crazy strategy to actually concentrate on the age group that is most fit and has a lot of experience already.
Yeah.
So not the young, not the old, but the what's called
ones.
the prime adult.
Yeah.
And this is what humans did. They concentrate on the prime adults, especially in medium-sized animals. And then you find out that they actually transported the parts, the body parts, that contained fat. And they did not transport body parts that didn't contain much fat. So these three patterns are actually showing us that humans were not using carbohydrates for the 65%. They were crazy for fat. And this is why we call the first paper that I published, Man the Fat Hunter. They were after fat.
I was going to reference that. I'll put it in the show notes for people because, yeah, it's what you talk about heavily in that paper.
Right. And the last paper that we published, we used that pattern to explain the extinction of large animals.
Was this the prey size decline as a unifying ecological selecting agent in Pleistocene human evolution?
No, this is the last one is something else. I don't remember the name of it. Something
might not
with
have
fat
that one
as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, we explained the extinction of large animals. And this is a phenomenon that is quite clear. It's more apparent in the later in the period. It's called the late Quaternary Megafauna extinction. Quaternary is really the period from 2.6 to 10,000 So the late Quaternary megafauna extinction. But really, we found out that there was already a trend against large animals that started much, much earlier, like maybe 1 million years ago. So this explained it, because what happened is that humans targeted the parts of the population that were more susceptible, that were more critical. First of all, large animals, they take now tens of years until they become they can contribute to the growth of the group.
Yeah, just due to
Uh,
low fecundity across the species.
right. Slow, very slow time. So it takes for an elephant, I think, something like 20 years before they start to be sexually mature.
Yeah. And so for the listeners who are not familiar with the term fecundity, basically, I guess in simple terms, it's reproductive time and how many children it has per each reproductive cycle.
Right. So even targeted species that were, if we were targeting, let's say, cockroaches, then they have small, they're fast and they can recover quickly. But if you target elephants, that's a problem. The problem for them. So large animals are targeting large animals create a pressure on them that it's very difficult for them to recover. And if on top of it they have like some climate stress, then that's our theory, is that actually it's a combination. It's a climate stress that they would have survived otherwise, but did not because of the added human pressure. The concentration on prime adults are the ones that contribute to their growth. They are producing the next generation. So if you target them, you are, of course, weakening the potential for growth of that specific species.
Yeah.
And the third one is just using partially the animal, also increase the pressure compared to other predators that use all the animal. So anyway, this was it's called the fat of the matter, the paper.
Yeah, okay. I'll pull that one up and share it for people.
Yeah, it's called the fat of the matter. So this explains why there was a extinction that is associated with the appearance. It's very apparent in recent times when people colonized the Americas and Australia and other islands. And it can be seen that quite a short while after they appear, the extinction begins.
Yeah. Yeah, we often find other sort of information and things where there's hunting areas where there's a lot of either bones and other types of things that sort of corroborate that we definitely hunted to a very large extent a lot of these large animals.
Right.
Yeah. It's
so
interesting too.
This is how this constraint on protein consumption and the constraint, the energetic constraint, caused our evolution. Well, the paper that you mentioned actually explains human evolution. It explains why we have large brain, because we had to deal with smaller and smaller animals, hunting smaller animals without spending too much energy.
Yeah.
And for that, we had to develop more and more sophisticated tools and better ability to track animals. That saves a lot of energy, because most of the expense is locomotion. Most of the energetic expense is on locomotion. And if we can save that expense by understanding nature, by knowing a lot about the signs that we find in nature, for instance, if we find, spurs of a certain animal, so we know this is like a nocturnal animal, or is it the one that active during the day? So we know if the spurs are fresh or etc. etc. So hunter-gatherers know so much about nature, it's unbelievable. We just cannot comprehend it. They know much more than any professor would ever know about the plants and animals in their environment, about their behavior and interaction with each other. So where do you store all that information and get it accessible at short notice? Because when you hunt, you need the information. What you do during hunting is actually you form hypotheses. Every time you say, okay, I think this animal now went to, if you know a lot about it, the enemy or the animal, you can see it from the spurs, is in stress, so it will go to the shade. So I think it's going to go to shade. I'm looking around and I'm seeing that, there's a group of trees over there. So I don't have to follow the spur one after the other. I'm running directly to that shade. So I save energy. So this is how the brain, and humans with a larger brain that could store more information and have it more accessible at short notice, were more fit. And this is how evolution works.
Yeah, it's the sort of advent of more in-depth cognitive processing and problem solving, along with the aspect that you had to communicate in hunting parties, and maybe you had to communicate with other people around and negotiate and organize with your tribe. So a lot of these higher level social aspects played a significant role.
One of the most controversial and most discussed subjects in paleoanthropology is the language, appearance of language. When did language appear? Yeah. Oh, of course, we think that it appeared quite early because, you see, what separates language from science, just science, one of the abilities of language is to express what's called displaced events, displaced in space and displaced in time.
Yeah, spatial temporal.
So if I can give you information about a prey that I saw 2 hours ago near that lake or near that tree or whatever, I save a lot of energy. You don't have just to randomly start to go around.
Yeah. And you use the example of
but there's
bees.
no way to do it with science. So the first expression of language that we know is bees. Okay, they dance. The bee dance actually is expressing a displaced event. So they tell the other bees, if you go that way, then in this direction you'll find the flowers. So in humans, it's more. You have to be more dynamic because your prey is more dynamic than
can move
than flowers. Yeah. So you need more sophisticated tool, and so that's our anyway. Our theory
so
of why language.
Some of the counters to that, and you address these in some of your papers, but some of the people on the plant-based side would say, well, what about the fire theory, or the ability to unlock more nutrition from carbohydrates? And there's people who say that was a precipitating event for the growth and change in our brains. But I believe you outlined that the sort of regular use of fire is not until significantly later, and so therefore couldn't really account for what we saw in these early changes in brain size.
Yeah, there's some arguments against this fire being a problem, solving a problem with actually cooking.
Cooking,
So
yeah.
the theory of Wrangham is that Professor Wrangham from Harvard is that cooking made us human. The need to cook. By the way, he's a vegetarian, so you can understand why he came up with this idea.
Yeah, consider the bias.
But later on, he had to admit that meat was also cooked. Anyway, there are a few arguments. One of them you mentioned is that really, like the habitual use of fire is not noticed until about 400,000 years ago. Now, if you consider that the evolution started 2.6 million years ago, and Homo sapiens appeared about 300,000 years ago, so 400,000 years ago is already quite late in the evolution of humans.
Yeah.
The other argument, and this is another paper that right now we are trying to submit to publish, is that you have to, and this is going again to the energy situation, you have to assume that maintaining fire costs energy. You have to collect the wood. So depending on the landscape, that can be very expensive or that can be very cheap, depending. And also depending how often do you move from one place to another.
Mm.
So if you want to stay for a few weeks in one place, you finish the easy wood, then you have to go further and further to get the wood. So in any way, getting the wood, especially in this recent hunter-gatherers, is a costly, energetically costly. So maintaining fire costs energy. So what is now you have to say, okay, this is the cost. So where is the reward? How much? If you look at cooking, the increase in energy absorption, let's say, that cooking allow for plants is in single percentage, 3%, 5% increase. Meat is not much higher than that, cooking meat. So it doesn't look like it was really that, high net energy to justify this activity.
Yeah.
So we think that actually when we find fire, let's say a million years ago, in some rare places where we find it, it was really aimed at preserving and protecting from carnivores. Because if you manage to hunt a buffalo and you sit on it and you can live on it for 2 weeks, let's say,
yeah, something's going to come
you
looking
want to
for
make
it.
sure that nobody else come and steal it
Yeah.
and kill you at the same time. So you have to protect yourself. And this is has much higher return, in our opinion, than cooking.
Yeah.
So anyway, this is the next paper. Believe it or not, it's one of the most difficult papers that I had. It's already rejected 3 times.
Really?
I won't start telling you the stupidity that we think is involved with it. But, this is academics. There are all kinds of reasons why people won't let you publish something. One of them is that you show that actually your papers show or really infer that their papers were bullshit. Sorry to say.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Unfortunately, people
So,
are too invested in some of their own things and tied to their ego opposed to actual
yeah,
evidence and truth.
exactly, exactly.
So
It's
coming
terrible.
coming back to
And sometimes they just cannot think differently than they thought before. They cannot change their mind. Very,
yeah,
very
rigidity,
difficult to change.
which is
Yeah,
unfortunate because
one of
that's
them. Yeah, he wrote a paper about the use of fire in recent hunter-gatherers, and he said that protecting from predators was not that important. But yes, hunter-gatherers today, or recent hunter-gatherers, had dogs. So and there were not that many predators already because the large animals disappeared. So the large predators, like lions, and there were not that many around. Anyway,
yeah. Well, look, I can say an anecdote. I'm from Canada, and we know very well that if you're out camping and you have food with you, you make sure you have a fire and you probably keep the food in a bear bag away from you because wolves and bears are going to come looking for that food. So it's a very simple one.
that's the problem with the paleoanthropology is that most of us are hunters in the table. We sit near the table,
So
we
true.
read papers, and we think we know how hunters thinks and behave,
Yeah, we're far
or what
far from it.
motivates.
I wanted to come back and just ask you a question. So I know part of your theory that you outlined there is that the reduction in a lot of the large animals and availability of fat and the transition to smaller animals was sort of one of the main things that shaped the evolution of our brain because we had to become more swift and better hunters and develop tools to catch smaller animals. How much weighting do you think that has in the development and evolution of our brain versus the animal-based nutrition? For example, the expensive tissue hypothesis, whereby we had more energy surplus and more nutrients available to grow our brain. How much do you think that played a role versus the process of learning to hunt and develop tools had?
Okay, here you have two kinds of explanation, evolutionary explanation. They're not the only kind, but let's say the traditional division is between proximate and ultimate. Proximate really talks about the procedures in the body. In other words, what genes changes, what physiology changed, and this is you explain how it happened. We concentrate on explaining why it happened.
Hmm.
So the, the two explanations are okay. They're not competing with each other.
It's
So
not
I
a
can't tell
dichotomy.
you what percentage they are forming. It's not the same. We're not talking about the same type of explanation.
That's fair.
So
That makes sense.
the yeah the expensive tissue hypothesis, I think is that paper 1995 is the most cited paper in paleoanthropology.
Yeah,
But
it's talked
really,
about quite a bit.
it doesn't explain why.
Hmm.
It just say the energy was the diet was high quality, so that allowed smaller gut. Yeah, why was the diet high quality? How was the diet high quality? What was behind it? The ultimate. So why? The question of why it doesn't answer. It just
Hmm.
answers how. How were we able to uh, tolerate such a high, expensive tissue in the body? Not why.
Hmm. That's a good way of breaking that down and viewing that. I didn't look at it in that perspective. And I think it's a very enlightening way of looking at it. And I would suggest that a lot of the research you've done probably answers more towards the why, looking at our evolutionary past. And I know we
Yeah,
didn't cover a lot of the physiological changes and perspectives. So I'll definitely reference some of your papers for people to look at. And I want to be mindful of your time as well, as I know we're going over an hour, but I did want to sort of come to a close in asking a couple of things about how the change over time towards Homo sapiens has maybe shaped what our diet should be, particularly around carbohydrates. So, we had smaller animals available. There were less of the large fatty animals. And so, the theory would go that, yeah, perhaps we had to find plants and other things to subsist on, but we still preferentially had animal sourced foods that were the primary source of our nutrition, which I believe would be in alignment with what you say. But there's then some of the counter arguments that I wanted to get your perspective on of, things like consumption of starch and how we have multiple amylase copies. And you also talk about particular polymorphisms to break down things like glycosides. So how does that start to shape what the human diet is supposed to be in the context of, the last, say, 15,000, 40,000 years? And what does that mean for our nutrition now?
Okay, I will try to be brief and cut straight to the chase. When I think about what the diet should be, I don't think that we should spend too much time about what is the ideal diet. I think that we should spend a lot of time what is a safe diet. What do we know? And and I tell you that there are many things we don't know, and few things we do. First thing we do know is that we are adapted to consume meat. And there are even recent examples of humans that consumed only meat and survives very nicely on it. What we don't know. We don't know what are the effects of the recent wheat species. We don't know if the producers of milli-meal or whatever corn products remove or what processes they do. We don't know our genetic composition. You talked about the amylase. Even if we assume, and this is not 100%, but let's say we do, that if you have 15 copies of ME1, so it's amylase that you find in the mouth, is conducive to consumption of a large quantity of carbohydrates, which I'm not sure we do. But anyway, even if we do know, we don't know. Who knows how many copies he has of ME1? In theory, we don't know our genetic composition. Some people can use vitamin A precursors, and other people don't have the genes to turn these precursors to vitamin A that's available in the body. How do we know? So, in my opinion, we know that meat is safe. Let's make it the largest possible component of the diet and try. The thing is, we don't even have to go so many years back. Just go 100 years back. Don't, because 150 years ago, there were no heart attacks. There were no, people ate, whatever they ate.
Yeah.
So, just a matter, in my opinion, it's just a matter of safety, because let's concentrate on the thing we know that are safe and stay away as much as we can for things we don't know whether they're safe.
Good answer.
So
I think
the most recent things are, the less safe they are as far as we're concerned, the less we know about them. And the more the more remote we are from the production process, the less we know about it. So that's my conclusion. That's my
It's a good take on nutrition. I think we have a tendency, especially in the nutritional science space and medicine, to overcomplicate nutrition. And that's why I like the paleo or evolutionary lens, because it paints a very simple and clear picture of what just ate what is evolutionarily appropriate, what was around for millions of years that we knew we consumed. Chances are, if you eat that, you're probably going to be okay. And if you eat these franken foods that we have no idea what's in them or how we're going to react to them, there's probably going to be some consequences. The irony of that, of course, is that that seems to go against the food guidelines for some reason, and there's a lot of pushback against that. But yeah, I think the work that you're doing and many others in the space clearly shows that we have particular patterns of eating and things that we had across millions of years, and so that probably shapes a relatively straightforward and simple approach to diet. And I guess on the amylase side, my 2 cents is just because there's some genetic changes that occur, it's probably because, yeah, sure, there was a temporary survival benefit, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the way we were meant to eat. It's more an adaptation to make sure we survived. I don't think that necessarily tells us the entire story. I would tend to look back like you have over hundreds of thousands, millions of years, and use that as my guiding principles
look.
towards.
Even today, there are humans with 2 copies and humans with 15 copies, and all the range in between. So it's not like everybody now has 16 copies or 15 copies. So you don't, and still everybody survive. For instance, studies that were trying to prove some association between the number of copies and obesity and all kind of stuff didn't find, they were not so convincing.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and I know you've got a theory as well, and I think you had a co-authored a section in a book on evolutionary nutrition around insulin and insulin resistance and its role in how we probably didn't consume an excess amount of carbohydrates, which we won't get into that one here, but I'll reference a lot of the work that you have done because you've covered quite a lot. So I highly recommend people go and definitely at least read the trophic levels, because there's a really good summary of all the different evidence that supports that position of being more in the carnivore or hyper-carnivore space. So yeah, thank you for doing the work that you are doing in that space.
let me just spend a minute about my book.
Yep, I wanted to close on that.
Which really stress the mismatch. So we were talking now about the mismatch between evolutionary nutrition and the present nutrition, and the problems that can arise from that. But really, I started my thinking about this hunter-gatherers, etc., by actually looking at the mental mismatch between the state that we evolved, because I believe a lot of our mental characteristics are in the genes. So I studied the hunter-gatherer societies and the mental side of hunter-gatherer, not the nutritional side.
Mm.
And the first book I wrote, it was in Hebrew, God knows, 11 years ago. So actually, just the nutrition side is like an appendix at the end of it. And so I translated it now and re-edited, of course. And it's in Amazon. It's called the Live Paleo Style. And it just identify the mismatch between the evolutionary state in which we lived in equality, in autonomy, authenticity. We didn't have to present, ourselves or a mask of now I'm the boss, now I'm the whatever. and all the stress that the present situation and the present mismatch cause to our to our state of mind, and what can be done about it. So I would say it's not only the food, it's also the mental side of the mismatch that is important.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would agree with that. And that's very much what we tend to preach here, as well as more a ancestral lifestyle, not just nutrition. So that includes, community, engaging with people, getting out in nature, being exposed to sunlight,
Right.
all the things that are evolutionarily appropriate probably shape not only our internal physical health, but our mental health as well, to a very drastic extent.
Right. It doesn't mean going to the jungle and start to live like
Yeah, I say that
but
often to
together.
people. Yeah, it doesn't mean that we
Yeah,
want to go
but
be
you
cavemen.
can do, there are many things you can do, uh, in modern life to increase or to decrease that mismatch, to take
Yeah,
care of it.
I think that should be the ultimate aim for what we do in the modern day, is take the things that are really nice about modernity. It's nice sometimes to have air conditioning and be safe inside away from the climate and things like that. But there are also things that we need to understand and accept, that we still need components of nature that are in alignment with our evolutionary history.
Right. Absolutely.
Excellent. Well, I'll definitely put the book in the show notes for people. And if people want to sort of follow your work and connect with you more, where can they find you?
Actually, I just found out that 2 blogs that I had were removed. I'm not sure why.
Oh
So
no.
they're not in the internet anymore. And I don't have any backup for them either, with hundreds of posts. But I active from time to time in Twitter, going by the name of Ben-Dor Miki, I think. And that's about it. I'm not that active anymore in other.
Well, you're working on other
And
important things.
the papers and the book. I mean, this
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's the important place to find your work. And I'll reference too, you've got quite a few talks on YouTube from other podcasts and from Ancestry Foundation and things like that. So if people want to see more of what you've done and some of the research that you present, I'll link those there. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time. I know there's a lot we didn't get to talk about, and there's a lot we could go deeper into. So maybe we'll catch up at another time, but I really appreciate your time and the conversation we've had.
Thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Miki. Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you made it all the way to the end, that's great. Please support our channel by liking and subscribing, as that really helps us out. And remember, you can get an extra 10% off all our products by using the discount code SOURCE10 at checkout. Thanks, and we'll see you guys in the next episode.